Hello there, and thank you for opening this episode of the podcast. It goes much better, if you're there. Hey, you really do make a difference. How is the family tree hunting going? I hope you're not taking too many evenings off. If you are, then you've come to the right place, because this is episode 49 of Talk Genealogy, the podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Talk Genealogy, the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Hello everyone, thank you for clicking on the Talk Genealogy podcast. We call it the podcast for the genealogists with too much time on our hands. And this month we are going to be looking at three Australian brothers. Now I need to give a little bit of an explanation. When I started out on Talk Genealogy, I made it a rule that I would never discuss my own family history, because I know that it's of interest to me and a few others, but very few others. Every genealogist can recognise that glazed look that comes over people's faces when we've got more than 20 seconds into our story. However, when I put together the printed version of my work, sticking very broadly to the rules that I set out on the episode of how to compile a genealogy, I decided to include a roll of honour. And I then had a very enjoyable few weeks researching the story behind these 8 distant cousins who had lost their lives during World War I and World War II. By far the most instructive story was the lives of the 3 Australian brothers in World War I. As I always do, I want to emphasise that I am neither a professional nor an expert. I'm an enthusiast, like you, who has spent more than 40 years digging up his family tree, not always in the right place. And these podcasts are really no more than me sharing with you some of the lessons which I've learned along the way. And I need to remind you that I am talking about ancestor hunting in England. Now, when I explore the emigrant trails in my family tree, I ask myself the question, was it a good decision? Did the emigrants get what they wanted out of the move? Now, to do that, of course, you need to try and deduce the reason behind their move. I have 3 significant instances of emigration. The first was in the 1630s, when a branch of the family moved to Massachusetts. Now, I have to say there is some doubt as to whether this is actually a proper identification of the branch of my family. I certainly have got some doubts, but however, that's not important here. They moved for religious freedom. And did they find that? Well, no. One of the wives was expelled twice from her church for having a spiteful tongue, and her teenage daughter was publicly whipped for walking with her boyfriend in an uncomely manner. So not a lot of religious toleration there. Then there was an emigration in the 19th century to Ontario, particularly Toronto, when 5 siblings from the same family, yes, 2 parents in Nottinghamshire, actually waved goodbye to 5 of their children, and it's unlikely that they ever saw them again. Well, what did they achieve? They responded to a flood of advertisements from shipping agents. Did they improve their life? Well, they had the adventure, of course. If a working class existence in Toronto is an adventure at the turn of the 20th century. But they didn't really improve their standing. Perhaps after 2 or 3 generations, they recovered it to the same sort of economic standing and social class as they'd left behind in Nottinghamshire.
You're listening to Talk Genealogy with Malcolm Noble. Here's some earlier episodes of the podcast. Episode 15. Let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs. Episode 13 was about the hearth tax. Episode 12, and it was Shakespeare, for example. Episode 9 discussed the medieval pipe rolls. Go to episode 7 for the companions of William the Conqueror. Episode 2, the Herald's Visitations, and our very first episode looked at working with Tudor wills. Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
So let's now turn to these Australian brothers. Did their forefathers, their grandparents actually, get what they wanted out of moving to Australia? Well, first we have to try and deduce the reasons for their move. Now, I tend to do this by trying to research what was going on in the village at the time. And of course there are numerous sources that we can go to, but I'll just give you 4 or 5 of the ones that I refer to almost without thinking. The first one is your own bookshelf. If you go to those old parish histories that you probably got, or local histories, not the modern ones, the ones written before, say, 1920, and if you look inside, try and go over again the local history at the time of the move. You may have missed just 1 or 2 lines from the vicar or the church warden that gives a surprising illumination of village life at the time. Otherwise, well, go to the London Gazette, and that'll tell you about bankruptcies and major sales of land and changes to property boundaries. It's not always the case, but a lot of it is in there. And from that information, you can work out the changing circumstances of tenants, etc. The next one I would go to is the special collections of your local universities. I would say the regional universities. Go beyond the county that we're interested in, and probably stick to the region. Now, special collections at university libraries, they're improving access all the time, and they're certainly improving cataloguing, so it's always worth keeping up to date what they've got on offer, and you will be surprised about what you learn. It's very rare that I visit a website of a special collection and don't come away with some new information of some sort. Again, you're looking for things that indicate a change of circumstance. The next one that you want to look for is journals that have already been written. Has emigration from that part of the country already been the subject of a study? To do this, I go to JSTOR, usually JSTOR.com. There are other similar sites. A lot of people use archive.org. To me, that is more useful for researching the United States. I tend to use JSTOR. You get access to 100 journals free each month. And again, it's unusual to make a search and not come up with something. Now, when I was looking at the Noble brothers and their ancestors' departure from West Ratting in Cambridgeshire, I came up with a paper that had been written in the early 1950s on emigration in the 19th century from Cambridgeshire. Ideal, just what I wanted, and it showed me that plenty of people were emigrating at the time and the reasons for it, which were basically family persuasion and low wages. The other place that you want to look, of course, is the British newspaper library run by the British Library, and for me a search there produced some evidence not only that times were harsh, but the parish was fractured. Now, remembering that this occurred during the era of village enclosure, and that was a process that was unlikely to be concluded without causing some division of the social classes. During that time, wages were low, and in this case, the winter was particularly harsh. The middle class in the village made sure that the newspaper reported the charity that they had given to the working class. This included money, blankets, clothing. However, those gifts came with a barbed comment that they hoped that the workers would respond with an obedience and a loyalty and respect that would earn them similar generosity in the future. It's a bit like giving charity with one hand and taking it away with the other, wasn't it? Clearly a reflection of a divided society. At the same time, the village was enduring a scandal of perpetual incest within one household. The prominent, and I use that word copying it from the newspaper article, the prominent parishioners met and announced their disgust and disassociated themselves from these practices. Now then, this was a statement again by the middle class, the prominent parishioners, who were clearly setting themselves apart from what they saw as the dirty and filthy habits of the riffraff. Two spikes of evidence of a divided society within that parish at the time. No wonder Amos and Mary wanted to get out.
You're listening to Talk Genealogy with Malcolm Noble. TalkGenealogy.com.
Here is the website that supports the monthly podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. You'll find links to previous episodes, a full list of books mentioned in the series, one or two details about other genealogy work I've done, and every now and then, though more then than now, a bit of a blog.
Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Now, Amos and Mary were on the Star Queen that sailed from Southampton on the 1st of October 1854. The voyage took 90 days before they arrived at Adelaide on the 30th of December 1854. So there's a lovely date there, isn't it? It's all about new beginnings and new years. During that voyage there had been 10 deaths but 8 births, and diarrhea prevailed to a considerable extent throughout the voyage. There was one case of malignant cholera which occurred the day after the ship sailed, and this proved fatal within 5 hours. There was no other case of cholera reported after the sailing of the ship, though dysentery and fever prevailed more or less throughout the voyage. So not a particularly tragic voyage, but you get the impression that it wasn't really very enjoyable. By the time that war came in August 1914, Mary and Amos's grandchildren had grown up. The 2 older brothers, Herbert and Stanley, were recently married with young families, while George and Annan were in their teens. The younger sons seemed to have assisted their father in his building business. George primarily as a plasterer, Alan as a carpenter, and at one stage a stonemason. Now George, in terms of age, he was the 3rd brother. He was the first to enlist, and he did so very promptly. The war was barely 6 months old when he enlisted in 1915, January. By June, he was aboard the troop ship Wandilla, sailing from Melbourne en route for Europe. The next February, so a year later, Alan signed on. He was 18 years old and no doubt considered the baby of the family. Later described by the Adelaide Courier as loved and respected by a large circle of friends, Private Noble was born at Fulham but lived at the Grange. He was educated at the Grange Public School and after leaving followed his father into the building trade. He was a member of the Grange Methodist Church and Sunday School, and he sailed on the troop ship Emmaus on the 11th of April 1916. Now, we don't know, but it may have been the eldest brother's feeling of responsibility for the baby of the family that Stanley Noble also enlisted at the same time. And this was quite a brave decision, because he and his wife Ruby had only been married for 18 months and they had a baby daughter, Dulcie May. So they were taking something of a risk. So 3 of the 4 brothers were now serving overseas. I would like to remind you that if you are interested in tonight's episode, I do recommend that you download it. The Talk Genealogy podcast is not financed in any way. There's no monetization, no paywall, no hidden episodes for you to find. So it is not really practical for me to keep it on the internet for long periods. So if you really want to build that audio library, I recommend you download the recording. In February 1917, so a year after Alan joined, George was attached to the 8th Field Ambulance Unit in France. This was a newly formed unit intended to transport casualties from the regimental aid posts near the front line to the casualty clearing stations, where they would be more thoroughly assessed and treated, and the best way forward decided. Now, perhaps this is a stage when we need to look just a little more closely at George's career, and I'm taking this information from the Adelaide Advertiser of the 26th of November 1918. It describes George as a bright and cheery person, and initially he was sent to Lemos in Egypt before being transferred to England, where he served at Brighton. He volunteered for the front and became a stretcher bearer in 1917 and was in many conflicts. Alan and Stanley, meanwhile, they were serving on the 10th Battalion of the Australian Imperial Force. We are fortunate that a reliable and informative history of the battalion has been written in a very conversational and accessible style. It is a good military history, and I hope that quoting at length adds some colour to the experience of the 10th Battalion. The first extract concerns the Second Battle of Bullecourt, no doubt referred to as Bully Court by the diggers. The history of this engagement is not without controversy. From the military history we read, "We now know something of what the Hindenburg Line was, fortified by every wire entanglement imaginable, backed by artillery, with observation on the enemy, with railways and roads which enabled him to throw an army into any weak spot." Now, if you want to follow the Battle of Bullecourt, you'll need a map of northwestern France. Look for the town, and to the southeast of the town you'll see a railway line. Well, that was the Australian entrenchment initially during the battle, and on many maps a few hundred yards to the north of that railway line you can still trace the Hindenburg Line. Now, during the battle the Australians moved forward, and that railway embankment became the second entrenchment. There is a very effective video on YouTube which shows the transition between the railway embankment as it is today and a photograph of the Australians in position. It is very effective. The transition is very cleverly done, and I recommend it to you. You'll find it on Then and Now, Australian Imperial Force in World War I, Bullecourt Railway Embankment, and it is on the Leon Kelly channel. Very, very effective. For an overview of the battle, the best video is probably From Tragedy to Triumph, Bullecourt 1917, and this shows the modern day parishioners marking the date of the battle by a long procession along the front lines laying floral tributes. I recommend both these videos. On the 4th of May, the 10th Battalion moved up to the forward area. The Germans attacked in some places with flamethrowers. Until the 9th of May, attempts to completely seize the village remained in vain. But on the 10th, the intensity of the fighting slowed down, only to resume the next day, supported by heavy German bombardment. The enemy shelling was heavy and accurate. The fighting was desperate, the bombardment terrific, and the enemy delivered counterattack after counterattack. In 10 days, no less than 12 counterattacks of tremendous force were delivered against the Australians. And the website remembrancetrailsnorthernfrance.com adds a further comment. Between the 10th and the 17th of May, British troops, particularly those of the 2nd Gordon Highlanders, joined with the Australians who were holding German lines to the east of the village, then seized the ruins of Bullecourt after very violent fighting. In the days that followed, the British and Australians were subject to constant artillery bombardment. It was during these bombardments that Alan Noble suffered the wounds from which he died on the 9th of May. Nearly 2 months later, the Adelaide Chronicle reported Mrs. J.B. Noble of the High Street Grange has been advised that her youngest son, Private Alan Campbell Noble, has died of wounds. Actually, Alan's mum was already dead by then, and they must be talking about her stepmum.
Talk Genealogy, the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Have you checked out some of our recent episodes? Go to episode 30 for the Tate Peeps, for example. Episode 29, Fleet Marriages and the like. No more negative proof was discussed in episode 34. While episode 35 asks us to make the most of marriage registers, and episode 48 looks at Admiral Sir John Hawkins and Tudor farmhouses.
With the loss of the youngest brother, Alan, there continued George with the Field Ambulance Unit and Stanley in the 10th Battalion. I want to read from the official history to give you a flavour of the early months of 1918. On January the 31st, the battalion proceeded to Aldershot Camp, making it in the early hours of the morning, chilled to the bone by an ice-cold journey in open trucks, but not too cold to make caustic remarks about the engine driver and the military in general. At this camp, though the fatigues were still fairly constant, the battalion enjoyed a month's spell, and boxing and football were organised. Cinemas, dinners and concerts were frequent, and on the 16th of February, the battalion celebrated Christmas Day, which it had been unable to do on account of being in the forward area. Prizes were given for the best decorated huts, and keen was the competition. Men sat up practically all night in order that their blankets could be sewn together and used as decorations, and the huts looked more like the draped shop windows rather than living apartments of the diggers. For a short while they became boys again, and the parcels which were distributed were opened with as much zest as they would have been 10 years previously. Sports in the afternoon completed a very happy day. Here the football team won the 3rd Brigade Cup and bade fair to bring off the divisional competition, but was beaten in one match by the 8th Battalion, which was successful right through. On the night of the 1st-2nd March, we're talking about 1918, The battalion went into the line at the Hollybrook sector and remained in the forward area until relieved at the beginning of April. It was about this time that the enemy, known to be holding huge reserves of troops released from the Russian front, was at any moment at almost any place expected to attack. Stand twos were the order of the day. On the first night, just as relief was taking place, a raid estimated at about 3 officers and 129 other ranks was made by the enemy on our front. The time was awkward, but the attack was beaten off with heavy casualties, and not before they had reached D Company's headquarters, capturing and carrying off Major Henwood, the company commander, who was killed on his way over no man's land. 7 other ranks were missing, but no information of importance was obtained. All the maps and important documents were afterwards found under the bed in the dugout. And one of the prisoners who was taken during that raid was Stanley Noble. However, the surviving packets of papers just show how confused things can be. One comrade reported, "We were just relieving when Fritz made a raid in our front line and captured Major Henwood and 4 men, one of whom was Noble. They must have made a fight for it, for their bodies were found the next day in no man's land and we buried them." So that suggests that Stanley was a casualty, which of course we know was not the case. And that note was written on May the 10th, so sometime after the raid. Another colleague reported, "I knew Noble, who was in D Company of the 10th Battalion. He was a tall, well-built man, about 25 years of age. On the early morning of March the 1st, the Germans raided us. I was in support and went up just afterwards and heard that Noble had been taken prisoner with 3 others. We then got out the dead and wounded, and we could account for all our boys." Private Whitelaw wrote, "I knew Noble well. He was in D Company, and on the 1st of March 1918, I was 30 yards in front of HQ in an observation post. Next morning, I got back and found that HQ had been raided in the night and was told that Sergeant Major Duncan and Noble had been taken prisoner. Private Bell was there, though he escaped, and he could give all information." A note from the Red Cross, dated the 8th of April. "Stanley Noble was missing from the 1st of March, believed a prisoner of war." A company sergeant supplied the following note: "I am, or rather was, very closely associated with both these men," meaning Noble and Duncan, "and can describe Private Noble as being well built and wearing a dark moustache, more or less deliberate in his movements, and about aged 32. They both disappeared during a raid on our position and were last seen being escorted by the Germans towards a German line. We are all very anxious in this company to hear of their being prisoners." On the 14th of May, it was confirmed that he was a prisoner of war interned at the major prisoner of war camp in the northern part of Germany. There are stories of some harsh treatment. There are some stories of a very bad treatment by the local women, because many of the prisoners were outworkers on farms. The main complaint was lack of food, and people even wrote about the lack of food on the reverse of stamps which they put on their letters. But it should be remembered that all of Germany was hungry at that time because of the blockade. Said that Harefield is actually the nearest village to London without being part of Greater London, and we are only a few miles from Edgware. The private owners of Harefield Hall, or a Harefield House more properly, gave it to the Australians during the war as a military hospital, and it was here that George Noble spent his last days. If you look at the photographs, you'll see that the patients didn't all slumber in a modest, stately home. The grounds became crammed with makeshift huts which sufficed as the wards. The war ended on the 11th of November, and 2 days later, on the 13th, George expired from pneumonia. He was a victim of the flu pandemic that affected the West at the end of the First World War. He is buried in the very quaint Australian military cemetery, a small cemetery attached to the parish church. I'm not going to record there because I don't think that recording in a graveyard is really the done thing. But George now rests only a couple of 100 miles away from where his grandparents left England, in the village of Rasratty in Cambridgeshire. Meanwhile, Stanley Noble was repatriated to England, arriving at Hull on the 11th of January 1919. And the packet of papers regarding his imprisonment includes a very touching letter from Ruby, his wife, written to the Red Cross and dated the 4th of February. Just a few lines to thank you for the information you sent me respecting my husband, Private Stanley F. Noble, who has been recently sent to England from Germany. He has mentioned in several of his letters about receiving parcels of foods and clothes from the Red Cross, which he said were very good. Thanking your society for all it has done for my husband and myself, yours sincerely, Ruby S. Noble. Please find enclosed a 10-shilling note to help with your work. I wish it was more, but every little helps. As well as the public memorials, I would just like to mention that both brothers are commemorated on their parents' grave, with their service records acknowledged. Stanley Thomas Noble returned home. He had a second daughter, Shirley. He raised a family with his wife, Ruby, and died aged 66 in 1956. The inscription on his grave reads, "His duty nobly done." There is another postscript to the story in that Dulcie, his daughter, joined the Women's Auxiliary Australian Air Force. My goodness me, there's more A's on that than my old report card. She joined the Australian Air Force in January 1942 and served until February 1946, and she was discharged as a flight sergeant. My goodness me, a flight sergeant in 4 years, that surely has to do with wartime promotions. She served at headquarters in East Sale, and she eventually died in 1998. Ladies and gents, thanks for listening to episode 49 of the Talk Genealogy podcast. The podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. I hope that tonight's episode has demonstrated the value of local history, not only in adding a certain texture to our stories, but also showing what was going on and why it was going on. I also hope that we've shown the richness of sources that are available on plain sight. The research for tonight's episode didn't involve any private subscriptions or scurrying around in the archives. They're all easily accessible there and just waiting for us. I want to thank Emily Brooks and Christine Noble for the voiceover and freeze effects for the music and sound effects. The Talk Genealogy podcast is recorded at the corner of a country lane in the middle of England. Please do leave a comment either on the site where you have accessed the podcast, or you can email me at malcolmnoble@rocketmail.com. It'll be lovely to hear from you. And next month we'll be talking about the Great Pipe Roll of 1259, what it means for your family history and how it can help you with your Latin skills. What a thing to look forward to, goodness me. Of course, that does depend on me not changing my mind in the meantime. Episode 50 of the Talk Genealogy podcast will be published at 5 minutes to midnight on the third Thursday in March 2025. Until then, I want to wish you all the best with your ancestor hunting, and please remember that if you see somebody without a smile, give them one of yours. Good night to you. Thanks for listening.